أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. ولعنة الله على أعدائهم ومنكر فضائلهم من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to begin by wishing everyone a blessed Eid, the greatest of all Eids, an Eid that marks not just the completion of a ritual like Hajj or fasting in the month of Ramadan, but a Eid that celebrates the completion of the religion itself. As I was reflecting on what to speak about tonight, I thought it would be beneficial to share some reflections on a ziyarah that was composed by Imam Al-Hadi alayhi salam, which is known as Ziyarah Al-Ghadiriyyah. This ziyarah is a ziyarah that Imam Al-Hadi recited on the day of Ghadir as he was paying tribute to Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. So these words are not the words of an ordinary person. Right? These words represent the way that a ma'soom pays tribute to the commander of the faithful. And the ziyarah begins in a very beautiful way. If you go through the ziyarah, it takes about an hour to recite the ziyarah, and it is perhaps the most comprehensive breakdown of the virtues of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Imam Al-Hadi alayhi salam summarizes for us the merits and the virtues of Amir al-Mu'mineen. What does he say? Among the things that he says in this ziyarah is Salawatullahi alayk. May Allah's salutations be upon you. Ghadiyatan wa ra'iha wa akifatan wa dhahiba. May Allah's blessings and salutations be upon you continuously and unended and uninterrupted salawat upon you, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. And then what does he say? He says, فَمَا يُحِيطُ الْمَادِحُ وَصْفَكَ. Imam Al-Hadi alayhi salam, he says, O Ali, the one who praises you, anyone who tries to praise you, they can never encompass your description. This is Imam Al-Hadi alayhi salam. And the Imam is not speaking in hyperbole. He's not exaggerating. The Imam is saying that there is no one who can truly capture the totality of Amir al-Mu'mineen's merits and virtues. The one who praises you can never accurately describe you. You know, brothers and sisters, we actually have a narration that is mentioned in Kitabul Kafi, one of the most important hadith collections that we have. And the narration is from Imam As-Sadiq, salawatullahi alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Imam As-Sadiq says, قال بينا رسول الله ذات يوم جالسا إذ أقبل أمير المؤمنين. The Imam, he says that one day the Prophet was sitting, presumably in his masjid among his companions, and Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib passed by. فَقَالَ لَهُ, the Prophet then turns his attention to Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, and he says to him, فَقَالَ لَهُ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ إِنَّ فِيكَ شَبَهًا مِنْ عِيسَى ibn Maryam. The Prophet says to Ali that, "Oh Ali, there is a similarity between you and Jesus, son of Mary. There is something that you two have in common." And then the Prophet, he says, and by the way, this hadith is found in Sunni and Shi'i hadith references. He says, وَلَوْلَا أَن تَقُولَ فِيكَ طَوَائِفٌ مِّنْ أُمَّتِي مَا قَالَتِ النَّصَارَى فِي عِيسَى ابْنَ مَرْيَمَ. If it wasn't for the fear that I have, that there would be some people among the Muslims, a group from among the Muslims, who will say about you what the Christians said about Jesus, meaning to attribute divinity to you. He says, لَقُلْتُ فِيكَ قَوْلًا لَا تَمُرُّ بِمَلَئٍ مِّنَ النَّاسِ إِلَّا أَخَذُوا التُّرَابَ مِنْ تَحْتِ قَدَمَيْكَ يَلْتَمِسُونَ بِذَلِكَ الْبَرَكَةِ. The Prophet, he says, if it wasn't for the fear that I have that people might exaggerate and attribute divinity to you, I would speak about you in such a way that if you were to pass by a group of people, they would rush and they would fight to take the dust from your feet in order to seek blessings from it. Now, why is this hadith important? This hadith is significant because it highlights that all of the narrations and the reports that we have that speak about the merits and the virtues of Ali ibn Abi Talib, on one level, it's important to remember that much of what was said about Ali was lost. We know, for example, that the Shi'as were persecuted for many generations. In fact, the library of Sheikh Al-Tusi, rahmatullahi alayhi, in Baghdad, who was the marji' of the Shia, who had rare manuscripts in his library, it was burned to the ground. Much of what was said was lost. And not only that, here the Prophet is telling us that there is much about Ali that I did not share because of that fear that you might misunderstand and make a god out of him. So what we have about Ali ibn Abi Talib in terms of reports that speak about his virtues and merits are actually very minimal, considering what actually existed and what was unspoken by the Prophet ﷺ. So tonight, we are speaking about a giant in our tradition. Someone who is so great and who occupies such a lofty position that not only are his virtues unique, but even the titles, the honorific titles that were assigned to him are exclusively for him and no one else. There was once a man who came into the presence of Imam Al-Sadiq, alayhi salatu wassalam, and he enters into the presence of the Imam and he greets Imam Al-Sadiq by saying, Assalamu alayka ya Amir al-Mu'mineen. He addresses him by saying, peace be upon you, O the commander of the faithful. You're the Imam of the time. You are the Imam, the leader of the pious. So thinking that this is a title that we can attribute to all of the Imams, he addresses Imam Al-Sadiq in this way. Imam Al-Sadiq says that, no, I don't accept this from you. Because this title is exclusively given to Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. So Amir al-Mu'mineen, it's not an exaggeration to say that his virtues are too many to enumerate. And then in the Ziyarah, Ziyarah Al-Ghadiriyyah by Imam Ali Al-Hadi, there's also another thing to note. So the Imam says, فَمَا يُحِيطُ الْمَادِحُ وَصْفَكَ. The praiser cannot encompass your description. And then what does the Imam say? وَلَا يُحِيطُ الطَّاعِنُ وَلَا يُحْبِطُ الطَّاعِنُ فَضْلَكَ. And the one who criticizes you, the one who criticizes you, O Ali, he cannot diminish your value and your virtue. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he didn't only have critics. The Imam alayhi salam, he had sworn enemies. Just to give you a sense into how much malice people had for Amir al-Mu'mineen, how envious, how jealous they were of him. For many, many years, for many decades, the location of his grave was concealed. In the same way, we go to the city of Medina and no one knows the exact location of the grave of Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam. For many decades, the Shias did not know where Amir al-Mu'mineen was buried. Amir al-Mu'mineen was buried in the dark of the night by Hassan and Hussein. Secret location. Why? Because they knew, the family of the Prophet, they knew that if the location of Ali's grave was made public, they would have exhumed his grave. Imagine that. They would have dug him out. They would not even have respected the most basic right of a Muslim, which is to be buried properly. So the Imam alayhi salam, he says, there were efforts, those who criticize you, those who sought to criticize you, they cannot diminish your virtue. When you look at the smear campaign that occurred after the death of the Prophet, I think you would be hard pressed to think of a single individual in human history who was targeted maliciously and who was character assassinated the way that Amir al-Mu'mineen was. In fact, there was a culture that was created after the death of the Prophet, after the death of Amir al-Mu'mineen, where people were cursing him qurbatan ila Allah ta'ala. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine how drastically life can change, where on the one hand, you have someone who during the life of the Prophet, they used to look at him in the same way a person would look at the stars. Amir al-Mu'mineen was incomparable to anyone. All of the Muslims, they owed their religion and their lives to Amir al-Mu'mineen. And then a few decades later, people are cursing you, seeking nearness to Allah through your la'na. Can you imagine that? So if you ever, there are so many lessons that we can learn from the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen, and I think one important lesson is that if you ever feel underappreciated, if you ever feel that you are not given your due right, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he is the most madhloom in that regard. Amir al-Mu'mineen, not only was he not appreciated, he was vilified. The savior of Islam was treated as public enemy number one. In fact, there's a beautiful line, and this shows you that it's a miracle that despite these malicious smear campaigns, the virtues of Ali still reached us. Right? And this is a promise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes. In Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاللَّهُ مُخْرِجٌ مَا كُنْتُمْ تَكْتُمُونَ. People can try to cover up the truth. They can try to conceal the facts. But one of the policies of Allah is that eventually the truth will be uncovered. Eventually the truth will be known. There's a Basran poet. He's a grammarian and a poet, and he has a beautiful line about this fact that Amir al-Mu'mineen, he was smeared and there were attempts to conceal his virtues, but yet these virtues are celebrated generation after generation. So it says, سُئِلَ الْخَلِيلُ بْنُ أَحْمَدْ عَنْ أَمِيرِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad is this poet from Basra, this grammarian. So he was asked about Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib. What do you say about Ali ibn Abi Talib? And look at what he says. It's a beautiful line. He says, ماذا أقول في رجل أخفى أعداؤه فضائله حسدا. What can I say about a man whose enemies try to conceal his virtues out of jealousy? On one hand, his enemies, they did everything to cover up and to conceal his virtues. وَأَخْفَى مُحِبُّوهُ خَوْفًا وَأَخْفَاهَا مُحِبُّوهُ خَوْفًا. So you have two groups. One group hid the virtues of Ali out of jealousy. And the other, which is his enemies. And the lovers of Ali, they also hid his virtues. But it was because of a different motivation. They hid his virtues out of fear of being connected to him, out of fear that they may be persecuted. So the lovers and the haters concealed his virtues. They hid them. وَظَهَرَ مِن بَيْنِ ذَيْنٍ وَذَيْنٍ مَا مَلَأَ الْخَافِقَيْنِ. But despite the concealment from both groups, his virtues fill the horizons. When we speak about Amir al-Mu'mineen, this is very important, brothers and sisters. This shows us, sometimes we worry a lot about, what people think about us. And to an extent we should. Our reputation is important. But sometimes you do your best. You're working sincerely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you have people who talk about you, who denigrate you. This aspect of Amir al-Mu'mineen's life teaches us that if you work purely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah will take care of your reputation. Allah will take care of your reputation. Amir al-Mu'mineen, believe me, even if you were to hire the most powerful PR firm, they could not have restored the image and the reputation of Amir al-Mu'mineen like it would have happened naturally just by him being the sincere servant of God that he was. That's an important lesson for us. So when we go back to this ziyarah, Imam Al-Hadi, he puts his finger on certain qualities of Ali that made him unique, that made him stand out. So Imam Al-Hadi in Ziyarah Al-Ghadiriyyah, he says, أَنْتَ أَحْسَنُ الْخَلْقِ عِبَادَةً. Imam Al-Hadi, he says, you are the best of God's creation in worship. This is the secret of Ali. All of those virtues that we admire about Ali, in fact, everything that we admire about Ali ibn Abi Talib, it stems from his relationship with Allah. His bravery, his wisdom, his steadfastness, his justice, all of that is a natural byproduct of his ibadah, his ubudiyyah. There's a narration that says that one of the companions of the Prophet, Abu Darda, he's a famous Sahabi. He says, I was sitting with a group of the companions of the Prophet, and we were speaking about the various virtues of a mu'min, and then the topic of ibadah came up. And each person would mention someone who they felt excelled in ibadah, in worship. So certain names were mentioned, and he said, I sat there quietly until it was my turn, and they asked me, who do you think is the best worshiper in the community of the Prophet? And he himself was respected for his piety and his righteousness. He says that if you ask me, there is no one who rivals Ali ibn Abi Talib in worship. So they asked him, why do you say that? He says, I'll share with you a story. Something that happened that I witnessed with my own eyes. So I'm not relying on someone's testimony. No, this is something that I've seen with my eyes about Ali, which tells me that he is matchless in the world of ibadah. He says, one night I went for a stroll in the outskirts of Medina. I was walking around, getting some fresh air. And suddenly, in the orchards of Medina, I heard someone supplicating. Someone who was engrossed in dua. He says, I came closer and I could recognize the voice, and it was the voice of Ali. Ali was out in the fields, in the orchards, and he was reciting dua. So as I was walking, I decided to stop and just listen. Ali had a very beautiful voice, and he recited with so much passion. He said, I heard him say the following lines. I heard him say, Ilahi, أفكر في عفوك فتهون علي خطيئتي. Oh Allah, my Lord, when I think of your forbearance and your forgiveness, my mistakes, my sins seem very small and trivial. ثم أذكر العظيم من أخذك فتعظم علي بليتي. But then on the other hand, I think about how severe you are in your retribution. And then I see and I realize the calamity that I am in. He says, Amir al-Mu'mineen was reciting, and I could hear that he was crying as he was supplicating. He says he was reciting, and he was reciting until the dua came to an abrupt stop. Suddenly there was no more recitation, and it stopped abruptly. He said, I walked a little bit closer because the moonlight helped me navigate through the orchard. فقال أبو الدرداء فأتيته فإذا هو كالخشبة الملقاة. He says, I came close and I saw that Ali was on the ground. He was stiff as a piece of wood, as a dry piece of wood. He was motionless. فحركته فلم يتحرك. I tried to shake him, to wake him up, but he was not responding. It was dark. He said, I panicked. And as I was rushing back, because now I have to go give the news to his family that Ali has expired, he has passed. So I was rushing back and I was saying to myself, Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un, mata wallah Ali ibn Abi Talib. I was saying to myself that to Allah we belong and to Him shall we return. Ali has died. He says, I rushed back and I knocked on the door of his house. His house was adjacent to the masjid. It was late. And I felt bad knocking on the door at such a late hour, but I have to tell them what happened. He says, I knocked on the door and Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, she answered. I greeted her and I did not know how to break the news to her, so I just told her what I saw. I said to her that I was in the outskirts of Medina and I saw your husband, I saw Ali supplicating by himself in the orchards. He was reciting and then he collapsed and I tried to wake him up. He was motionless, he was not responding, and I'm afraid that your husband has passed away. Fatima Zahra alayhi salam, she knows who she's married to. She knows her husband. She says to him, O Abu Darda, you don't have to worry. هي والله يا أبا الدرداء الغشية التي تأخذه من خشية الله. That what happened tonight, Fatima Zahra says to him, what happened tonight is not something that only happened tonight. This is something that happens to Ali every night. He becomes overwhelmed by the presence, by the majesty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is his condition. So Abu Darda, he says, going back to the companions that he's sitting with, he says, فَوَاللَّهِ مَا رَأَيْتُ ذَلِكَ لِأَحَدٍ مِّنْ أَصْحَابِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. He says, I saw, there are many great worshippers among the companions, but I've never seen someone regularly faint when they stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now you might think that that's a bit extreme. No, brothers and sisters. We are the ones who are unusual. Ali is responding the way that a rational person should respond when they stand before the Lord of the world. The reason why we don't experience that is because we don't know who God is. We're oblivious. We are heedless of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. Now the point of me sharing this story is not for us to just, celebrate this virtue of Ali. Ultimately, Amir al-Mu'mineen is meant to be that person that we look up to. Now, Allah doesn't expect us to faint when we pray. Allah knows our capacity. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does expect us to take our salah seriously, to take our ibadah seriously. That if we come in these nights and we listen to the life and the legacy of Ali, one of his legacies is the legacy of ibadah. So if there's anyone here that hasn't really focused too much on improving that aspect of their faith, tonight is the night. Right? Tonight is the night that you say that I'm going to try to be a little bit more like Ali ibn Abi Talib when it comes to my concern for ibadah. At the very least, my dear brothers and sisters, we shouldn't fall short in fulfilling our wajibat. And the hope is that we can go beyond just the bare minimum. Because one thing that we learned from Ali is that when it came to Islam, he never did the bare minimum. That's a very important lesson that we learn. That we should not be people who strive for mediocrity when it comes to Islam, when it comes to our faith. What made Ali Ali is that he was an overachiever in the world of ibadah. And this is something that we need to internalize. Another quality that is mentioned in the Ziyarah is that Imam Al-Hadi alayhi salam, he says, addressing Amir al-Mu'mineen in Ziyarah Al-Ghadiriyyah, he says, وَأَخْلَصِهِمْ زَهَادًا. Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, he also had this other quality. And that is that the Imam, he was indifferent about the material world. He lived in the dunya. He enjoyed the dunya, but the dunya never controlled him. It's easy for you and I to say that we are zuhad, that we are ascetic people. But the reality is that many of us have never actually been tested with the dunya. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, during his khilafah, you can tell a lot about a person when they ascend to the highest seat of power. Everyone can talk piety and righteousness when they don't have any power. But it's very different to maintain that piety when you have unlimited power. Amir al-Mu'mineen, when he was the Khalifa, and this is not an exaggeration, if you look on today's map, Amir al-Mu'mineen was the Khalifa of almost 50 countries on today's map. The tax revenue that was generated from these Muslim lands is something that's astronomical. When Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, when he became the Khalifa, right, in the political sense, when people recognized that he is the one who should lead, Ibn Abbas, and this is mentioned in Nahj al-Balagha, after the assassination of Uthman, the Muslim community was a mess. It was complete anarchy. And there was a need for a very strong leader to unite the Muslims. And this is where everyone realized that no one can get us out of this mess other than Ali ibn Abi Talib. So, delegations from all around the Islamic empire, they came to give allegiance to Amir al-Mu'mineen. And usually this is, if you look at the history of prime minister and kings and emperors, this is usually a moment that you get to bask in the glory of power, where people, they're extending their hand, and usually this is a moment that's very exciting for a leader. Ibn Abbas, what does he say? He says, and this is mentioned in Sermon 33 of Nahj al-Balagha, he says, دخلت على أمير المؤمنين. Ibn Abbas became the right-hand man of Amir al-Mu'mineen, especially during his Khilafah. He says, I entered into his house, into his room, and people were waiting to meet. You have dignitaries, you have tribe leaders, they're waiting to give allegiance, to formally give their allegiance. He says, I entered the room to see what's the holdup. Is Amir al-Mu'mineen, is he putting on his best abaya? Is he trying to perfect his turban? What is he doing? He says, I saw him repairing his sandal. He was fixing the strap on his sandal. Ibn Abbas says, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, everyone is waiting. Amir al-Mu'mineen ignored his question. He looked at Ibn Abbas and he said, Ya Ibn Abbas, ma qimatu hadha al-na'l? Oh Ibn Abbas, what is the value of this sandal? فَقُلْتُ لَا قِيمَةَ لَهَا. Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, it's a used sandal. I mean, if it wasn't yours, it's a used sandal. And it's a sandal that you had to also mend. If you were to take this sandal to the marketplace and sell it, I don't think anyone would buy it. It's valueless. Look at what Amir al-Mu'mineen says. He says, وَاللَّهِ لَهِيَ أَحَبُّ إِلَيَّ مِنْ إِمْرَتِكُمْ إِلَّا أَنْ أُقِيمَ حَقًّا أَوْ أَدْفَعَ بَاطِلًا. He says, I swear by God. And Amir al-Mu'mineen, who is As-Sadiq al-Amin himself, when he makes a qasam, we know that the Imam is not exaggerating. He says, I swear by Allah that this old sandal is more dear to me. It has more value to me than the entire Khilafah itself. Unless, when does political power have value in the eyes of Allah? Is if you use it to establish rights and address injustice. This is what gives Khilafah value. Now for us, my dear brothers and sisters, yes, you and I are not going to become the Khalifa. We're not going to preside and rule over an empire. But we have, each and every one of us, we have authority. You have authority over your kids. That authority comes with responsibility. You are accountable for the authority that you have over your kids. You are responsible. Yes, Allah has given you some authority over your spouse, your wife. Allah is also going to question you. That only has value. These positions only have value if you're using it to uphold haqq and to dispel batil. So we have to ask ourselves, are we just with the power that Allah has given us in our lives? Whether I am the president of a nation, or the president of a jama'ah, or I am a teacher who has authority over students, or I am a father or a mother, no matter who you are, Allah has given each and every one of us some power. And the question is, what are you going to do with this amana that Allah has given you? Because power, just like all blessings, these are blessings that come with accountability. They come with responsibility. And then, my dear brothers and sisters, I'll end with this. Another thing that Imam Al-Hadi mentions about Amir al-Mu'mineen is that he says, وَأَذَبُّهُمْ عَنِ الدِّينِ. Amir al-Mu'mineen, there was no one who was more unwavering in his defense of Islam than Amir al-Mu'mineen. We have to have ghira over our religion. Defending Islam at the time of the Prophet, it required military defense. And Amir al-Mu'mineen, because that was the type of defense that was required, he was the first one. He was always at the front lines. Now, today, especially in this part of the world, our defense of Islam is not in the form of weapons. We have to be able to defend Islam intellectually. This is the way that we defend Islam. Because hundreds of millions of dollars are spent every year to smear this religion, to malign the character of the Prophet. So if you want to be a defender of Islam, the way that Ali defended Islam, you can't be ignorant. Ali ibn Abi Talib, he had his sword, the sword of Dhul Fiqar. But today, your sword, your Dhul Fiqar today is knowledge, is ilm, is taqwa. And therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, as we reflect on these virtues of Amir al-Mu'mineen, especially the last one, this is why Islamic schools are very important in our communities. Because I know a lot of people, they've gone to great schools, they've gone to Ivy League schools, and they're Muslim, but they are defenseless in the face of the enemies of Islam. They're helpless. What's the use? You learn everything, but you don't learn the most important thing. You don't learn who your Lord is. You don't learn what the purpose of life is. It's important that we do not go through life being defenseless people. And the way that you equip yourself is through the knowledge, by attending these programs, and most importantly, by paying attention to the environments that you put your children in. This is how we defend Islam, by building this strong identity and creating this culture of learning. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us and guide us and illuminate our hearts with the wilayah of Amir al-Mu'mineen. And we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the great ni'mah. Alhamdulillah alladhi ja'alana min al-mutamassikin بولاية أمير المؤمنين علي ibn Abi Talib salawatullahi alayhi. We ask Allah Azza wa Jal to honor us with His Ziyarah in the holy city of Najaf. And most importantly, we ask Allah Azza wa Jal to crown us with His intercession, His shafa'ah on the day of judgment. يوم لا ينفع مال ولا بنون إلا من أتى الله بقلب سليم. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين.